Hi folks, welcome back to Sty Stories. Here I am at Camp Wilderness Thriving Fundamentals with nothing much better to do right now but talk to a camera. Rory went off to town with a friend of hers and went out for lunch, so she went to the big city. And so Sty figured he'll do another Sty story. To tell you a little bit about when my family and I moved out west, for us, we didn't know if we were going to move there on a permanent basis or if we were going to just go out there and spend a year or two exploring and just make an adventure of it. It ended up being a 4-year adventure. We were out there 4 years. We chose, because work was hard to get and we knew that we could get by on quite a bit less than most people, we decided we want to move up into the backcountry and spend a year in the backcountry, try it out. So we headed up in the backcountry, and all we had was a pickup truck, a tent camper, and a lot of outdoor gear. So the spouse and I and our 4 children, we headed up into the backcountry. Now, we homeschooled our kids, so we hauled the curriculum with us. That was probably the heaviest thing that we hauled, was all their books. But we got up in the backcountry as far as we could drive, and we found a nice spot to camp next to a creek, and we figured, well, we'll spend a month here or so and scout out other spots. Maybe we'll find some place better, and we'll have to contemplate on how we're going to make it through the winter, what we're going to do for the winter. You can't live in a tent camper for the winter. Well, I found this beautiful piece of property. It was 80 acres. And on that 80 acres, up on this hill, now this 80 acres was only about maybe a mile below the tree line. It was up there. The elevation was pretty good. Beautiful property. Had 2 mountain creeks running through it. It had 2 large horse corrals, had a really nice root cellar, and it had a cabin that was built in 1906 out of cedar logs, cedar-shaked roof. It was leaning at about a 45-degree angle, sitting up on a hillside. And I saw that and I thought, I bet you I could stand that thing straight. And I bet you we could spend the winter in there. Now I got to find out who owns this property. Well, I looked into it and I found out that the Peck River Investment Company, I think they were out of Boise, Idaho, owned that property. So I wrote them a letter and said, you know, my family and I are trying to have a wilderness adventure, wilderness experience, and living in the backcountry for a year. And that property, there were some old buildings that had dilapidated buildings that had collapsed, and it was a general mess in one area. And I told them, I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll clean up those old dilapidated buildings. I'll tear them all apart, stack the lumber, clean it all up, in exchange for 1 year's use of your property. I said, and we'll stand that cabin back up, and I'll improve it enough that we can stay in it. And at the end of the year, we'll leave, and you can have the improvements. I told the wife, I said, I bet that they're not going to bite on that. That's, yeah, right. Only in your dreams. Well, all of a sudden one day, into our camp rolls this beautiful Mercedes-Benz, and it's got 2 fellas in suits. And they asked who I was, and I told them, and they said, well, and then I realized they're holding my letter in their hand. And they said, our board of directors looked at it, and they thought that your letter was well put, and they would love to let you use the property in exchange for cleaning up those old tore-down buildings. So we got the property for a year. So we moved into that cabin after we straightened it up. A friend of mine had a backhoe tractor down in town. We drove about 7 miles down into town. It's just an old Forest Service trail that goes up that mountain to where the cabin was. And then the cabin had a driveway that was about a mile long that was just as wide as a single pickup truck. So I drove down into town, borrowed the backhoe, and drove that backhoe all the way up the mountain, got to the cabin. I took that backhoe and I pushed that cabin up straight, drove some pole barn spikes into it, and there, now it's standing straight. So we moved into that old cedar cabin built in 1906 and had a potbelly stove in it, old rough sawn wood floor in it, very rustic. Used to be part of a logging camp is what it was, and that's all that remained of it. And that's what ended up being our cabin. So in our videos when I talk about fellas came to my cabin and we went from my cabin to someplace, that's the cabin I'm talking about. And we spent about 9 months at that cabin. And at that cabin we had a lot of very unusual, some exciting wilderness adventures that came from staying in that cabin over the winter. And I'll touch on those in some other Sty stories. But the nice thing about that cabin, it put us right in the heart of the backcountry. After the first heavy snow, there was no getting in and out of there until spring. You couldn't drive a four-wheel drive pickup truck in and out of there. Right around Christmas time, we had some fellas tried to come up to us to deliver some packages to us that couldn't get up there with snowmobiles. The powder was so deep, they weren't able to get through. So, so I came in and out off that mountain almost every day, at least 5 days a week, by snowshoe to town. And that was 6.5 miles off the mountain, and then about 2 miles following the highway into town. So it was quite the adventure. And I'll touch on a bunch of the things that happened at the cabin as time progresses here and I do other videos. So thanks for hearing me out. Welcome aboard. Getting to know Sty pretty good, I bet. Love to get to know you out here at Camp Wilderness Thriving Fundamentals. You all check out our webpage. Hey, see you later.